then when the break, I think the break was overpassable, wasn't it?
I don't know. I heard it was about Wagner's anti-Semitism. They would have arguments about that, and it could have been heated.
That's the trouble with Nietzsche. He was so self-destructive that he should have just shut up, remained friends with the Wagners, said to Mrs. Wagner, "Find me a nice match, will you, so I don't have to be a lonely bachelor anymore." That's all he had to do. He had a job, everything,
Yeah, and he would have gotten free tickets for the Ring, but those are expensive, I'll tell you.
But he never would have become famous.
Any thoughts about the latest batch of recordings and readings? I'm even less prepared than I usually am this week to say anything.
Yeah, I read too. It's also in the. I think you wrote it down wrong in the meetup. In the notes, the third set of notes, it says to read to page 149. In the tape labeled in the recording labeled number 5.
Yeah.
At the very beginning, he says read to page 149. So it's in two places, 149.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's why anyway. I got there. I got to 149. It's fairly easy to read excerpts. So I like the balance. I like the fact that Nietzsche talked about a lot of different things. He talked about the coming collapse of civilization. He talked about the death of God. He was able to talk about himself as a Zarathustra. Compare himself to Zarathustra in a sense. Coming down. What if you could only communicate by coming down from the mountaintop, giving up the gods you had communed with and worshipped for 10 years, the snakes and the birds and the lizards and so forth, come down the mountain and have to deal with the filthy human rabble and do it joyfully. That was kind of the idea of Zarathustra, I suppose. So it's the way how he saw himself. Basically having a lot of things to discuss. He insults, in one of these sections, he insults Descartes. In another section, he insults Kant. So I really like that stuff. I was really glad to see that.
He's arrogant. An arrogant German. That's so common.
He had a lot to talk about. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, what stood out for me, which I appreciated, and this is where it's interesting about the time that he wrote this and how it's still quite relevant, is that, so this is now my interpretation of his work, his idea of embracing chaos. And it seems to me we have a real avoidance of wanting to face chaos. We don't see it as part of the natural evolution of going through life and it being necessary for our growth. But as soon as we have chaos, we're trying to get away from it as soon as possible. Whereas my overall perspective of, as I was reading this week's and listening to the lectures, was this idea of embracing chaos that he sort of brought back into the fold. And then the second thing that I thought stood out for me was also our awareness of our egocentric nature. So those were just sort of global things that I felt came through. Natalia, are you going to share?
Metallia is a quiet little mouse in training to become a lioness. Might take a few years.
Yeah, it certainly is a remarkable challenge to the our common understanding of how to act and how to be. It was interesting that when I started a Nietzsche group, once one of the participants said, well, they resisted the idea of doing Nietzsche, and even though she didn't know anything about Nietzsche, but she just said she knew people who were heavily influenced and admired Nietzsche, and she said she didn't like them. She didn't like the way they took Nietzsche. She didn't like the way Nietzsche affects people. And I can see the point she was trying to get to was that there's something there is a whiff of adolescence to Nietzsche's arrogance. There's a whiff of iconoclasm. Just turning over the tables, just raging against. But I don't think it's as directed as that. I think there is a point, and I think his challenges are certainly well taken. But there's that adolescent energy, isn't there? There's that kind of yeah. Turning over the established boundaries and so on.
Well, I don't hear. That's true. I'm ready to talk about a couple more sections of things that I liked. One was the section 2 of the preface, the fact that we don't respect our bodies enough, that our bodies are basically part of the function of our minds. So we would not have a mind without a body. We can't discorporealize ourselves, and so that the subsistence of the body is integral to our thinking. What our body experiences, in a large way, determines what we're able to think. I love that. I like that. Completely respect that concept. That the mind is not caged up in a liquid brain case. It's actually just simply another organ of a complete human body. And the other thing was now I think I've lost it.
Certainly, it wasn't the vaccine that did that.
Certainly is one of the reasons why Nietzsche and the continentalist philosophers are so, but Nietzsche specifically, are so unread and disliked by contemporary academic philosophers, because he talks about all these things that you just don't talk about in established, respectable, responsible philosophy. Yeah, he talks about the body. He talks about illness and sickness, and you bring that stuff to philosophers and academic philosophers, they just, what? Why are you talking about that stuff? And being grounded in nature. And yeah, it's all the stuff that philosophy doesn't talk about, that Nietzsche directly confronts as being important, extremely core to who we are as humans. And I think he's right. I think that is the stuff that gets ignored and really ought to be included in our understanding of humanity and life and meaning and everything.
The other thing I was thinking about that I just forgot was the relating to the militant aspects of personality. That we need to be more militant. We need to be. He's not necessarily calling for violence and aggressiveness, but he's talking about virility. We need to become more virile. We need to challenge the different aspects of existence, and by doing so, we become more powerful. You know, we actually. Oh, here it is. It's number 290, right? One thing is needful, giving style to one's character, a great and rare art. So in other words, every one of us should be manic. Every one of us should be a stylistic entity, not just, you know, maybe with a crazy mustache like Nietzsche had, or a nice suit of clothes like who was that? Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens. The idea that you present yourself in a certain way is good for the eyes. It's good for the eyes, and good things are good. In other words, he talks about ugliness being need to be seen. You need to be able to see ugliness when it happens, and you need to be able to think about ugliness and reflect on ugliness. So, and he says, in contrast, it is the weak characters lacking power over themselves who hate the constraint of style. They feel that if this grievous compulsion were imposed upon them, they would have to be debased by it. They would become slaves. As soon as they serve, they hate service. And such spirits, who can be spirits of the first rank, are always out to fashion or explain themselves and their surroundings as free nature, wild, arbitrary, fantastic, disordered, and surprising. And this is good for them to do, for only thus can they do themselves good. So it's basically saying, I think, that there's different kinds of people, and these different kinds of people need to be express themselves and be viewed by society and have all of society learn from them. He even says that in the future, he expects that there will be Christian philosophers who are, to a certain extent, atavistic, but they will need to be preserved as types so that you'll have a sort of like Christian, and I think you have that today. You have, I've seen speeches by agnostic Christians and so forth, like people that that basically incorporate the ethics or the ethos of Christianity without subscribing, without while cutting themselves free of the dogma, and I think that's what he's talking about here too. Is that even Christians will become type.
I'd be wary of saying must, as far as I know, that, you know, using the evil word existential, that the existential philosopher is primarily, one of their primaries is choice, freedom. Therefore, he's suggesting alternatives, and it's always going to remain your choice where you go, or it's without you being the one, it's probably a little bit pointless.
Well, he thinks it'll be good for everyone. He thinks that, in other words, he thinks that the whole society will benefit. Also, remember that he believes in the collapse of society, the coming collapse of society somewhere near the end of the 21st century. So, if this is going to happen, it's a possibility that it happened in the beginning of the 20th century, that it was articulated through Germany's failures to perpetuate a war in Europe. But if he was right about the timeline, it could be the end of the 21st century, and we're having very similar kinds of social trauma both social trauma and social discontent, dissatisfaction in the United States and elsewhere. We have some fairly crazy foreign policy ideas in Europe and the United States and so forth. So I think
sorry, could you illustrate the crazy?
just the one example is the idea that everyone is going to follow. It's anti-Nietzscheanism. It's Nietzscheism. It's the idea that everyone is going to follow the same moral program. That if once all the countries unite behind the same moral program, then world peace will be assured. We'll have an institution that'll control the whole world. United States arms, will play a role in that hopefully, and we'll get everybody on the same track of following the same human rights kind of like program, and everyone having a similar type of government.
So a living death, in other words.
You're right. Yeah, that's exactly what Nietzsche was basically envisioning. And people at very high levels in Europe talk about this openly, and also Mike Pompeo, who's basically copying them. They've been talking about it for a few years. Mike Pompeo is echoing some of that.
And Nietzsche being the one who always wanted to break out of prison by the sounds of things. Mm-hmm. He didn't want to be in a prison. That was the very first thing I think I picked up with Nietzsche when I tried to read him when I was a teenager. You could pick up somebody who looked at everything that was being taught by the external sciences. He had a good mind, he knew it all, and he believed it. You couldn't sort of doubt it in the 19th century. But his instincts rebelled against that picture. That was the very first thing I ever picked up about Nietzsche. He was a person at war with himself and at war with the world in a spiritual sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's gone quiet. Hello?
Yeah, go ahead. We need noise.
Okay, good. Okay, there's a couple of things I'd like to say. I mean, firstly, we're talking about Nietzsche. I mean, I think he's a great thinker, perhaps a genius, but I don't think we should overlook the fact, to me, that he seems to make a lot of mistakes. Mistakes like his notion about the death of God and everything's going to collapse after that. Well, it didn't happen, I mean, there's a lot of agnosticism, around in the world. And again, I cite China. It's never been a religious place, and they're getting along, but perfectly well. Another kind of mistake that I think that Nietzsche made is a will to power. On one hand, he sees the will to power as an aspect of mind, of spirit, of passion, of feeling. Yet on the other hand, he regards it as an aspect of all being. Now, this is, to me, I think, is a contradiction. You can't have something which is an aspect of mind, yet also an aspect of all being. I mean, the properties are different. And so, to me, when I read Nietzsche, I have to think about, he's a great thinker, but you have to, I think, interpret the spirit of what he's saying rather than the letter. He's pointing at something, and I'm interested in what he's pointing to rather than what he's saying.
Yeah, Derek, that was very pointed and I think and true. I think one thing about Nietzsche is that he believed that the whole history of thinking had been permeated by errors. So he would be in a sense, he would be a first one to agree with you that thinking itself carries mistakes with it. and then a certain amount of mistakes. And the history, of course, carries those mistakes. The history of thought, equally with every other aspect of life. And about the death of God, he himself said that he was too early. He, in this book, in the Gay Science, he said that we would not be able, because it was too early for people to embrace the death of God. We don't know exactly when that time will come. All I can tell you is I'm announcing this too early because it's not going to happen right now. The world is not ready for what I have to say. So he considered himself a bit of a philosophical futurist in that sense. On the what you said about the will to power, some of that may be true, but his idea, his concept of mind was not Cartesian. In other words, a lot of philosophers having a different philosophical attitude would kind of take a different approach than he does. And they could either kind of like obviate some of the things he said because he wasn't Cartesian. He didn't believe that mind was separate from being. Because he did believe that mind was part of being. That mind is just simply an effect. He believed, based on the low level of 19th century brain science. He had psychologists. He drew on the wisdom of psychologists like Sigmund Freud. So he was kind of at that level of being a friend of Sigmund Freud and being able to carry on a conversation about late 19th century psychology. He could be educated in that field, but he didn't have any idea about what the mechanisms of the mind, from a standpoint of modern brain science, he didn't have any of those concepts. So his when he was talking about being and mind, he meant pretty much the same thing, because he actually says in the preface, section 2, that the body is underestimated. The body is the mind. So and for him to say that was like him saying being and mind are the same thing, because he wasn't really a philosopher of being in the sense that, Heidegger, would be. So Nietzsche is all over the map, but what's amazing is how many attractive places he lands. And that was part of his philosophy too. He wanted to be attractive. He wanted people to say, wow, what a fancy suit of clothes or a nice mustache or whatever for a philosopher to have. These are fine ideas. How many books have you read by Nietzsche, by Herr Nietzsche? It was like this. It's true. He wasn't as popular outside of Germany, German-speaking areas, but he was probably. But he definitely had his. He was definitely trying to make his ideas attractive. The other thing that I liked in this reading, in this section of readings last week, was the idea of personal philosophy. He really looked down on personal philosophy. He said that people that have a personal philosophy are kind of a waste of time because, we have philosophers already. How valuable are they? Well, some of them might be valuable, and some of them might deserve to be studied. He wasn't kind of like denying self-denial. He wasn't in self-denial. He wasn't denying the importance of philosophy. He was just saying that if you got a self-philosophy, you're probably deluding yourself because you really got a life to live, and the life you live is going to be everyone basically has attitudes and but the way he put it is everyone has a set of ethics. Everyone is going to comport themselves a certain way in life, and They're going to do it fairly consistently, and the way and the actual ideas that they have about how they should behave are going to be very individualistic. They're going to be different from pretty much every other person's. Otherwise, we wouldn't constantly be wandering into arguments about these things. So it's just the Nietzsche is all over the map. Very easy to criticize, very easy to enjoy, and it's all by design. It's by the fact that his mind worked that way. He was an encyclopedic thinker that would just jump from one idea to another, partly because of his philatelist background. He was somebody that, not philatelist, whatever he was, the student of Greece, the person that could compare one culture completely different from another and then find out what those cultures had in common and what that meant for the evolution of, and then begin to develop some attitudes on what that meant for the evolution of mankind. So this is I've grown to respect him a lot more just in the last 3 weeks.
And I think you were looking for philological background.
Philological.
Yeah, he's a philologist and not a philatelist, but not being bad at philatelist either. Everybody should do it once in a while.
Yeah.
Go down to the post office,
Yeah, I did it for a year or two when I was a kid, I think. Yeah, I was like licking the stamps and all that. Yeah. You stick them on pieces of plastic. I'm sorry.
No, that's good. I appreciated Matt's lectures again. I was having a little difficulty making the connections to the text in terms of where he came to the conclusions that he did. I suspect that, of course, he's probably bringing in his more comprehensive knowledge of Nietzsche to fill out things. So on top of the two parts that I thought was the chaos, the attention to chaos and the egocentric nature, I mean, he does still bring up that idea of that balance between sense and nonsense. Nonsense could be also chaos, or he defines it as such. But I like how he shifts our thinking from, brings about the awareness of how we are often guided by what will take us into a space of comfort, and to challenge that. So that would also be, putting us into the chaos. But rather than looking at sort of these truths, rather we're using experience and so forth to open up our minds to, what is our attachment to certain thoughts, rather than determining if they're true or not. Why do we desire this particular information to be true? And what are the possibilities that lead us? So he's really gone from sort of these setting strong foundations, more to a focus on process, in my opinion, where he's talking about the way we should live. And the way we should live is less tied to principles and so forth, or thoughts in general, sort of these standards, but question them. And as humans, at some point, we have to act on what we feel is true at the moment. But for the most part, there should be always that living in the gray kind of experience is again, the terminology I gave to it, is rather living in the black and white, living in the gray. So that's what stood out for me with that. But again, I'm going back to the text, even the excerpts, and sometimes I'm thinking, where did Matt get that idea? Where does it say that in the text? What's the reference? How did Nietzsche actually say it? And then Matt's interpreting it and putting in layman's terms often. So yeah, I was having difficulty making the connections to the text.
I'm sorry Audrey isn't here tonight. One thing I was impressed was she actually is going into some secondary sources. She picked up, I think, David Allison's Reading the New Nietzsche, and some of the other secondary sources that analysis and criticism and research from other scholars who are that Matt mentioned in some of the at the very beginning. And I do think it does help. I think I mean, I've gotten a lot from reading other people's analysis.
The question is about chaos. So Nietzsche's earlier point was that chaos was banished by the steering towards the Apollonian in the post-Aristotelian culture. So how many people have promoted the concepts surrounding chaos in the culture from the time of, say, the classical Greeks up until now? He was saying that the image of chaos was something that was very powerful in the pre-Socratic Greek. But that great evil thing was covered up with its fig leaf to be hidden from the virtuous public or something like that. So we've been going like that for 2,500 years.
Yeah, and now Matt said that, his awareness of Buddhism was a little bit off, but the fact is, this whole idea of some practices, sort of Zen practices where there's this calmness and so forth. It seems to always, there seems to be this in certainly current culture, Western culture, to avoid the chaos. And it makes me curious that Nietzsche picks up on this, because I find it quite relevant. And like you say, Stephen, where did this happen historically? Was this the trend for some time to avoid chaos? Was it seen as a bad thing, or is Nietzsche the only one that recognized the value of chaos?
I think I would like to answer that. I mean, surely the fragmentation, if we could call it that, the brokenness of the idea of what there is or truth, I mean, hasn't it been developed in existentialism and postmodernism? I mean, as opposed to the Apollonian, as we might call it, the Anglo-Saxon analytic kind of thinking, where we have to get things right. There are right answers. We need a symmetry in our work, etc. Instead of a brokenness that can, produce some ideas that will lead somewhere. I mean, is that what you're looking for, Stephen and Shauna?
Yeah, well, it's just, how much is concepts surrounding chaos, being present in modern culture. I mean, Michael Moorcock, I now realise, must have ripped off Nietzsche when he reintroduced cosmos and chaos in his Elric novels as something separate from what we ordinarily grasp as good and evil. But, the ordinary person doesn't really think in terms of chaos, or if he gets any glimpse of it, it's something to be avoided. That's the normal trend in ordered society.
And Matt says that, sure.
Of course, we've reached a point now where in America we've got the two sides at each other's throats, the left and the right. And how are you going to get out of this? It looks like finally, beautifully, chaos has come down. The lords of chaos have come down. I think there were even some protesters screaming worship to the lords of chaos and stuff like that. And one thing I would note about the current era, and this has been going for a generation or two now, is we're living with an educational system which no longer teaches the classics the way it used to. I mean, classic literature and history was something that was taught to me in high school. But I've heard rumours that, the latter day education has been bypassed. And so we have people in all walks of life running around each other, but they don't have that grounding in anything, a classical literature or classical thoughts of any type. They're just playing it by the number,
And I know Matt references that Nietzsche, prior to Nietzsche, the arts and the sense and the artistic aspects were covered in Greek times, and and then he doesn't reference anything else. And certainly he does comment that Nietzsche is also coming from a very Eurocentric perspective. And I know Michelle notes that, there's other cultures that have had different different awarenesses of chaos and different, she might speak to that directly. But yeah, I think Matt pointing out that Nietzsche also was Eurocentric and just looking at the world from that and looking at options or where to go from there. He was still sort of stuck in that Eurocentric model. So I'm sure there's other examples of different cultures that did embrace chaos more. And certainly, as an interesting aside, in organizational management, there was this whole unfolding, probably misinterpretation. I have a friend of mine's a physics professor, and when I talk about chaos theory and sort of the organizational management using some of these principles and kind of making it their own, he said, "Oh, that's not really part of physics anymore." But this whole idea was sort of the strange attractors and chaos theory and how to work more within chaos rather than finding quick solutions. And so there was some of that I came across where chaos was not seen as the enemy, but that's sort of outside the philosophical world.
Can I riff on that for just a second? When I read this excerpt in Dionysius and Apollo and Dionysius, I was just wondering if this isn't just about chaos. This is the combination of chaos with order. The fact that you're going to have both influences in life, that you can't have. They're basically difficult to have matter without some kind of order, and hard to have life without order, and that's what Nietzsche is interested in talking about. And so you got chaos is kind of the principle, the relieving principle, or the contrary principle, the antipody, and the fact that you have chaos means that there must be some order that's being, chaotified, and you have even in the chaos theory, right? You have a mathematical formula that can cause objects of great beauty to be constructed out of the chaos formula, which I can't recite because I'm not a very good mathematician.
But which one precedes?
Oh, it's the one that creates the Mandelbrot.
I mean, does chaos precede order, or does order precede chaos?
I would say that they're both coactive. Yeah, you could never prove that's chicken and the egg stuff. So it's like saying who was born first, Dionysius, or was it? And you could probably prove that by being an expert on Greek mythology, but who was born first? Was it Apollo or Dionysius? And maybe there isn't a meaning to that conundrum. So some things don't have meaning. Just like this idea that Nietzsche was motivated by realizing that there was a loss of meaning in German culture, and to me that's a bit of a simplification. But there was a tendency for him to think very dramatically and to reflect on the dramatic nature of society itself, the chaotic nature of society itself. In a society, German society, 19th century German society, that had believed that it totally understood order from the ground up, and that it was busying itself in the implementation of order for the benefit of the rest of the world. So Nietzsche's concept of chaos was really to adjust the two, to simply have the two in to juxtapose the two in some kind of a coherent order which man could use in the same sense as a Greek could have used it. An ancient Greek man or woman could have used it to adjust the antipodes of their lifestyle, of their life, which did exist, by the way. It was difficult to live in ancient Greece, perhaps even in comparison to 19th century Germany. So so he's trying to establish the basis for creating civilization, which is not just creating more order and then order on top of order, but order, combinations of order and chaos that would allow human life the greatest benefit, projecting itself into the future. That's what I believe. Yeah.
The other historical clash, which is what people often allude to, are the Viking Wars, where the Vikings represent the Dionysian elements. And this is attractive even today, even with these stupid TV series they now. You have Ragnar, who's everything physical, will to power, fighting all these Christian countries are all about, doing the right thing and being ordered and so on. It was actually Rudolf Steiner who drew that out, pointing to the Dionysian nature of the Viking invasions in the Dark Ages.
Good point.
But this is a thing even in the old movie with what's his name, Ernest Borgnine in it, one made in the 50s. That's deliberately presented. The Vikings become what everybody wants to be, but the Apollonian won't allow them to be. But they secretly yearn for it. So, of course, they can get away with creating these awful people on the screen because they're the bad guy. That's cool, you can do that. But bad people have got to do bad things, so that's acceptable in an Apollonian society.
What is it, Fortnite? I'm not an expert on gaming because I almost can't stand playing games. I play 2 or 3 games, but it's difficult for me to play computer games. Hard for me to learn all the moves and things. But Fortnite, I believe it's that one, is all based on Viking culture. So the whole game is based on Viking culture and the fact that you have people who are Vikings, who are very skilled in using deadly weapons and things like that, trying to kill each other, trying to kill other peoples. So, or at least to take their stuff, in the right way. So in a certain way. So I don't know the game perfectly, but I've seen like clips of it where these Vikings are having these big these very stirring battles. So I'm just saying that is this is one of the best-selling games for the gamers. So it's possible that this is becoming a very lively part of the new economy. Also, the new culture. Also. We had the Game of Thrones on TV, which I didn't watch. I know very little about it, but I think it's the same idea. From the same time, the idea that you're living in the medieval times, and then it's either you have power and you wield the power, or you have war and you fight a war. So I think that type of, I believe it's that kind of, from my level of ignorance of modern culture, I'm thinking it's that kind of thing. Yeah. So talking about the Vikings, I think, is very relevant because it's really important artistic motivation in modern society, and I'm sure Nietzsche would love that. Did he talk about Vikings?
Yeah, that's a curious question. He did refer to the ancient Teutonics as being a sort of I suppose you could call them a sort of a Viking element. The trick is the Vikings, as they call them, historically are the ones we know the most about. There was a whole heap of Teutonic invaders, but the sources aren't aren't as deep. But towards the end of the Dark Ages, you have this, all these monks who were pissed off with the Vikings raiding churches, giving them bad press, but it was still a press. Because there's other types like the Huns and possibly the Mongolians, but yeah, Attila the Hun's another fantastic example of the animal man, storming the gates of Apollonian civilization. The man of energy. Seems to be the case. What's another? Zardoz is another example where the barbarians are trying to get inside the vortex dimensions. If anybody's ever seen the movie Zardoz, John Borman, 1974. So it's the idea that the old Apollonian civilization gradually decays because it lacks energy, and the barbarians come in to give the culture, re-energise the culture. Well, you could probably say this about China as well. It gets its share of barbarians and so on.
Oh, H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. Eloy and the Morlocks.
Oh, right. Yeah, okay. So you're comparing the Morlocks to the Dionysian sort of thing. Even better, you had the Uber Morlock in the second film. The 2002 remake, or where they did the time machine again, and we got the Uber Morlock, the Morlock with the intellect, who was running the rest of the Morlocks.
The Morlocks were the intelligent ones underground. I think they would be more the Apollonian. The Eli's were the kind of the children who didn't know what they were doing and needed the protection of the Morlocks. Of course, they were also eaten by the Morlocks, and so I think they would be more the Dionysian. But
well, the Morlocks actually operated machinery in H.G. Wells' book out of instinct. They'd just been there for so long that they'd become instinctual machine operators, and they'd been the servants of the Eloi originally, but then when they got hungry, they decided to start eating the Eloi.
Yeah,
so
well, they took over.
Yeah. But no, they were just more or less dumb brutes that were functioning out of instincts largely, and the Eloi were the remnants of the upper class, which had become the food, and just become so apathetic
and childlike.
Yes. So they were shrunken in stature, and like small children or something like that. Yeah, it's been. I think. Oh God, I think I read that book when I was about 12 or 13 or something. Still sticks in my mind. It's so 19th century and antediluvian. Overpowering. It's like reading James Churchward's stuff about the continents of Mu or something like that. That 19th century stuff's just way out.
Well, we could talk about Wells all night, but let's not. But it was a good point.
Well, the tragedy is that Wells possibly didn't read Nietzsche, did he? One would expect he might have come across Nietzsche at some stage. Jack London, one of his novels was an attack upon Nietzsche's ideas, The Sea-Wolf, where he created, a character which was what he thought Nietzsche was suggesting as a Superman, which, if it's true, he was claiming one of the Borgias was the Superman, then it looks like Jack London got it right.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but the Asian cultures, the Eastern cultures, are often seen as a culture of harmony, which is in some respects, because I live there, in some respects is true. It's a cliche. And the Western cultures are conflictual. They are Dionysian. And perhaps I mean, the most extreme form of the Western culture, perhaps, of conflict is the US, where at the moment, we're having a lot of conflict there. you can see the strengths and the weaknesses there. And I mean, in recent, history, we recently spoke about, a Teutonic order, or implied it. And when you think of Teutonic order and conflict, I mean, I can't help but thinking of Hegel here. Hegel and a dialectic between one thing and another, and producing a synthesis which breaks up and then becomes a conflict again, leading to a further synthesis. So I can't help thinking, I mean, of themes here, of conflict and the synthesis, perhaps held by Nietzsche and Hegel.
I think there is a relationship there. I don't think it's exceedingly strong. As a matter of fact, I don't even. It's not completely clear what. I think probably Nietzsche's exposure to Hegel was probably average, like average for an intellectual German person. So in other words, he might have read something by Hegel or something about Hegel and understand it kind of like on the kind of level you just described. There was this idea that Hegel was talking about nature, talking about aspects of life, and so in that sense he could be called perhaps a child of Hegel, not necessarily being a very studied in nature in Hegel, and he didn't really turn his gaze on Hegel much, which I think is admirable for him to have not done. But there is that kind of like the embracing of life that Nietzsche does. I think is definitely consistent with some interpretations of Hegel. That basically Hegel is a evolutionary thinker. He thinks about how things evolve, or in the Zizek type of interpretation, how things emerge. Basically, Nietzsche had mastered that kind of thinking without necessarily having a name for it. He just called it philosophy. And Hegel was not a favorite target the way Kant was, for example. Hegel would just simply be somebody who was influencing German thinking and German life in a very general sense. It was also there was a turning away from Hegel. I don't know whether that. I guess that occurred because of the relative power of Kant's philosophy. That Kant was becoming the more popular of the two figures in Germany, and the attention was drawn away from the popularity and the importance of Hegel. So, but I'm not an expert on that. I don't know what actually took place. I'm just glad that there's a Hegel kind of reawakening now, so that there is a lot of Hegel study going on. We got Zizek, who's great. Zizek is great, and the fact that we have a living Hegelian, and other people want to become living Hegelians like Zizek, maybe without all of his personal habits, but that idea that it's actually become contemporaneous, and maybe there wasn't a contemporaneous Hegel in Germany in Nietzsche's time, because maybe partly because of the power of religion, because all of that philosophy was considered very suspicious because of the culture itself being very highly Christianized. So I think that's part of the reason for Nietzsche's point of departure, as an anti-Christian,
That was
basically.
in Birth
Yeah.
of Tragedy, wasn't it?
Yeah.
He took a few swipes at Christianity there and got himself into immense hot water.
Sure, yeah, but that's a tradition. Anyone who thinks ideas that are kind of like opposed to Christian dogma can be labeled and can be attacked as an atheist from inside the church, and someone inside the protection of the church, a minister or somebody like that, can attack a philosopher and call him an atheist, and we really shouldn't pay attention to what this guy's saying because this is the kind of thing that we can't really tolerate.
I was hoping to broach something. It came up last session, and I feel it sort of spilled into this week. So with Nietzsche, he talks about the dangers of prescribed morality, or his concerns with prescribed morality. One of those is this attachment to suffering and avoidance of suffering. And so I find that's an interesting, I'm maybe on a personal level, that's why I've attached myself to that. I actually did get a secondary reference from Beyond Good and Evil. I don't know can I share my screen? No. Do you want me to?
Yeah, I'll get you.
I hate reading out loud, guys, but I'll try and at least read some of the little bits. But it basically is talking about that he's against this idea that we should be worried about our less fortunate, or I don't even say it that way. It might be best just to use his words entirely. Okay, let's see here. Can I enlarge it here? Okay, so what they would, I'll just sort of randomly choose this spot. What they would fail to attain with all their strength is the universal green meadowed happiness of the herd, together with security, safety, comfort, and alleviation of life for everyone. Their two most frequent chant and songs and doctrines are called equality of rights and sympathy with all sufferers. And suffering itself is looked upon by them as something which must be done away with. We opposite ones, however, who have opened our eye and conscious to the equation how and where the plant man has hitherto grown most vigorously, believe that this has always taken place under the opposite conditions, that for this end the dangerousness of the situation has to be increased enormously. His inventive faculty and dissembling power, his spirit, had to develop into subtlety and daring under long oppression and compulsion, and his will to life had to be increased to the unconditioned will to power. And he goes on, and basically, I think what I gathered from the Nietzsche perspective, his perspective is that as a whole, as humanity, as a whole human race, that we should allow these things to simply unfold, that there'll be the have and have nots, and they serve a purpose. Now, I would like to be corrected on this. But
I think maybe his idea is not to hold a value toward that. So don't consider it to be good or bad. Just consider it as necessary. So take away our values from that. I don't understand why you'd want to, but I think it's a way for him to try to have us reconsider what we find important.
for some reason, this example that he gives, when he speaks to this, it reminds me of when, a natural disaster happens and it kills a lot of people and it's very unfortunate. But yet other people would say, well, these kinds of things need to happen because, we need to have checks and balances so that we don't overpopulate. And for some reason, what he speaks of reminds me of that situation, that while it's unfortunate, somehow it's necessary.
Nietzsche's entire point was that he was talking about the dark force of nature. And to him, the view of nature is, Darwinistic survival of the fittest. Was that absolutely his view or simply something he was presenting? We don't know. Nietzsche's trick was always to hold up a mirror to Western civilization. And Western civilization was always telling us it was a Christian, but actually doing something else. That was one of Nietzsche's points. But he would never be saying that you have to be this if he was a true existentialist. It always remains your choice. If you want to be charitable to the beggar, that's your choice. You can choose to do that. But what probably what he's avoiding is a compulsive morality. Your morality always remains your choice.
Yeah, I think he has a habit. Basically, Nietzsche thinks that we have habits of morality. Part of them are inherited from Christian morality. Well, in a sense, all of them are inherited from Christian morality. And he sees that these habits that we adopt are mistakes. The idea that we want to have human rights. We want to have everyone treated the same. We want to end all suffering. And that these sort of like become causes without cause sometimes. In other words, I think that's something that's become a big issue today, is that whenever you say there is a loss of rights, it makes you a good person. So you say Rohingyas, and then all of a sudden Buddhists, Myanmar Buddhists become bad. Like what and then once you sort of like realize, well, wait a second, now Myanmar Buddhists are bad, or Buddhists are bad, and who are the Rohingyas? Oh, they're Muslims. Okay, so they're Muslims, and they had there's a problem where some of them were migrating from Myanmar to the section of Myanmar that was closest to Sri Lanka, over to Sri Lanka. So it was kind of like, okay, and there was violence. So, and some people were said to be dead, so that there was evidence of violence. So that, but the idea is that you say there are human rights violations, and you become moral, and you become virtuous, and then the people that we thought were virtuous before, the people we thought were more virtuous, which were the Buddhists, suddenly become unvirtuous, and so that's the kind of thing he's talking about. Is that you can just sort of flip on a theme. You can create morality, which is just a theme that doesn't have any content itself. Yes, if people died, that's content. If people were actually forced to migrate, which is questionable, but that would be content too. So that's the kind of world that Nietzsche saw. A world where, by saying certain kinds of magic words like suffering, injustice, rights, and so forth, that you would actually be able to gain resonance, gain moral resonance. And part of his principles, I admit, Nietzsche was really a strange guy. I mean, part of his principle is that everything we believe about morality and attitudes and goodness and so forth could all be mistakes. So that's in a way that's kind of that's the part of Nietzsche I love the best, because it says you need to rethink this stuff. You need to think it all over. It needs to be thought about again. And he doesn't ever say trust me. He just says, I'm ahead of my time. Don't trust me.
Well, and I'm wondering too if people could elaborate. When he talked about this idea of suffering, it seems like he also went in a slightly different direction with it, in which he said, here the aristocrats talk about suffering as part of their religious doctrine or their belief system, but in reality, there's suffering all around them that they're not acknowledging or doing anything about. And so when the slave uprises, it's because they truly have a direct connection to their experience, to their feeling of righteousness, their feeling of what needs to be made right, where the aristocrats have sort of become blinded by this sort of blanketed idea of, well, we shouldn't have suffering. But there's a disconnect between how they actually live and the morals that they spew out, if you will, or say they adhere to. And so am I correct, and I don't know if anyone could speak to that that's where Nietzsche was also coming from with this idea? I don't know if anyone has more.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that...
Sorry.
Go on. I mean, I was going to say that I think the idea of suffering is very seductive for many schools, for Nietzsche, for Christians, for the modern world, because suffering involves cost. And where you have cost, you want to attribute value. So suffering, I think, naturally, accumulates value. It's seductive and misleading in that way, I think. And I'd also, sorry, whilst I'm speaking, I'd like to speak to a previous point here about dialectic and seeing morals and morality perhaps where we shouldn't. I mean, from a position outside the US, I see the habit in the US of using the terms good and bad for people a lot. And this seems to be, it strikes me from a non-US culture person. It's very striking how people are attributed as good or bad guys. It seems to be an attribution of a morality where it shouldn't be. And perhaps also this seems to be, I don't know, an endorsement of a previous idea that I presented of the US being a more conflictual culture than the Eastern one.
My understanding is that Nietzsche is trying to destroy, actually, not just criticize the romantic view that we have a past civilization and past thinkers had about life. His feeling is that life affirms itself. Life propagates itself. Therefore, when we talk about the weak and the suffering, he should be understood in light of his life affirmation. Life affirms itself regardless of our created morals. For example, in the animal kingdom, you have plenty of example where they kill the weakest animal in order for them to survive. For him, for Nietzsche, this is neither good nor bad. It's what life does. So all those examples about the weak people and the suffering and so on and so forth should be seen in the light of life affirmation, which Nietzsche really is one of his guiding principles.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of life is a bit, indiscriminate. I mean,
exactly.
As human beings, we have projects, we go forward, and we need more of as a practical, requirement, we need more guidance. We need more of a objective than simply life. We need a kind of life,
Well, there is very little more than life, actually. That's why there is very little more than life. All the other one are constructs. And the question with the constructs, with them, there is lots of hypocrisy.
Yeah.
And Nietzsche is trying to combat that hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we have to remember, for him is the overman. The overman founded not on the will to power in the way vulgarly we understand him, but with the notion of innocence. Innocence. That's a critical point. So when you read the three metamorphoses of the camel, the lion, and the child, it's not that just the child, it's the innocence of the child. So he wants a civilization based on innocence, not on hypocrisy.
Yeah, I mean, a technical point, but I mean, I think there is more than constructs in life. I think there are things.
Now you go back to life. But before you were saying there is more than life.
Yes. I mean, I think there is more than life. But I mean, what is a human life? Human life is just not a organism. Human life is a consciousness. Human life is value. Human life is experience, pain, wanting. These things are not constructs. I think they are structures of consciousness which cannot be avoided by a self-conscious being in the world. By simply being here, we experience them. We don't need a society to have certain kinds of experiences. So I mean that's a technical point, but by and large I agree that all our ideas perhaps are constructs, but not everything that we have are constructs. I mean that's just a little point, or a big point.
Actually, in one place he even specifically says that life may be the wrong word. But we don't know what a better word would be.
Yeah.
But I mean, on a technical point, you are right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why he's aspiring for the Overman, which we should not confuse with the Superman. Übermensch is Overman, not Superman. Okay, the Superman is the idea of the Nazi people, which he clearly anticipated and clearly does.
I mean, a better word, in my view, rather than life, would be, consciousness. That's a very debatable term. Or for human beings, self-consciousness. And to me, that brings a focus to what we can do in life.
The trouble with the notion of consciousness is that what is consciousness?
Exactly.
I mean,
yes. We have
even if you go to the even if you go to the Upanishad or the Gita, they're talking the media consciousness or the media self and the deeper self, the primary and the secondary. I mean, but these are really constructs.
I don't know. I mean, you see, what is a consciousness? I mean, a lot of people have said it has features like intentionality and subjectivity and cognition. I mean, these things are, I mean, we're getting a bit off Nietzsche here, but Nietzsche didn't go into these kind of questions.
He wasn't interested. He wasn't interested in that kind of ontology. Yes. He was much more interested in the kinds of ontologies that would matter to life. As that's where he saw his project, the kinds of ontologies that would matter to human beings.
Yes.
And those ontologies include thinking, include the reactions of individuals to culture, the behavior of individuals, the horizon of individuals. One of the things he talks about here is this idea of a horizon behind which there's an infinity, and how scary that is. That if you look towards the horizon, your horizon, that if man looks at his horizon, his particular horizon, that he's going to see infinity, and that is scary. But nevertheless, the metaphor that he's using is a boat. So that he's in the sea, and he's on a boat. The sea itself actually could be calm, completely calm, in which he would have the ability, if he had a calm sea, he would have the ability to actually make progress toward his achieving his project and achieving his horizon. So I think, in Derek, in the terms that you were kind of mentioning, I think that is what Nietzsche was on track with. Where Nietzsche was on track was finding the horizon of life, and that exists for every individual who has a purpose. And if this individual, has a particular purpose, then he sees some kind of fulfillment in his horizon. And then of course that opens up a whole can of worms, which is like investigating what are the different kinds of applications of that principle. So, so he wasn't so much concerned with the dissection of consciousness as he was of understanding that consciousness existed. He did mention it. He mentioned that it existed, and it was something that man could view as a tool, or he could simply just rely on it for his ability to ambulate. Man could use it in an almost animalistic way, without ever using the term animalistic, as far as I know. He would say that he would say something like that. He would say like animals, but man would perambulate around using his intellectual equipment, or misusing it, so to speak. So go ahead, Derek. You're dying to say.
I would like to say that. It seems to me that Nietzsche is just not. He wasn't concerned so much, and that's true, about the idea of a consciousness, but he was not able to perform a phenomenology in the way that later thinkers like Husserl and Sartre were able to do. So it just seems that he didn't have the tools. And as part of my underlying critique of Nietzsche, although I think he's a great thinker, that there were tools, there were concepts that he didn't have, so he couldn't use them.
I disagree completely. Go ahead, Diego.
Derek, first of all, we should recognize that he claimed himself to be a psychologist. Therefore, the notion of consciousness is very much present, and it's part of his project. But this project is that he's not comfortable with the present understanding of consciousness, with the present understanding of our moral system. He's trying he's very critical of our concept, and he's trying to present a new vision, a new understanding. And by the way, I like your idea of the notion of the boat. The boat in the scale of the infinite. But we should strive and not be really afraid. Okay, it is fearful, but we should not be afraid. And the notion of the boat is precisely to go to the other shores. What are the other shores? We leave behind our present shores, our present space, with our present values, and we move to a new territory, with new space, with new vision, new morals.
So Derek, the reason I disagree is that I think Nietzsche, I'm reading the notes, I think Nietzsche was a brilliant ontologist. He just hit it.
Wrong word. Wrong word. I'm
No,
sorry.
it's the right word. He used that
No,
word himself.
No, he's critical of ontology.
Huh?
He's critical of ontology, understood as the science of being, capital B. I wouldn't use the word ontology with Nietzsche.
No, he was an ontologist, and he uses the word ontology himself. And he taught Freud ontology. That's I can outline. I've got some notes with one of the most complex ontologies that he actually did in a passage where he's talking about morality in the first week's assignment. We had a reading which was really drenched in ontology, and it was from Nietzsche's notes from the 1876 or something like that. But the ontology there is very rich, and he's always using ontology. He just hides it. Sorry.
If you go to the index of all the books, the word ontology doesn't even appear.
Oh, but he did use it. I think it came up either in the Will to Power or in this book in the Gay Science. He uses it. But it's dripping. His methodology is dripping with ontology. He learned that from Kant and the idealist, the German idealist. It was just basically he wasn't abandoning ontology. He was just using it very effectively, very seriously. It was part of the basis of his criticism of Christianity. Let me give you just this one example, Diego.
Yes.
Morality is, with its mendaciousness, aims to disguise itself as a truthfulness to show to mankind, which understands from morality a certain teleology, which affects the self, who is able to gain insight from that morality and reflect on it, falling into despair, resulting in nihilism.
Well,
so I'm just saying that this is one example of extremely complex, detailed, multifaceted ontology as given by Nietzsche. He had studied the Greek idealism and learned ontology from it, from his previous study of German, his study of German philosophy. Go ahead.
I think. Sorry to butt in there. I think we may have a disagreement about what the meaning of ontology is. One way to distinguish it. I mean, Heidegger makes a distinction between ontology and the ontological and the ontic, where the ontology is the being of something and the ontic is the expression of it. I mean, I think ontology is a difficult concept. When we get to Sartre, he explicitly uses the word ontology of a consciousness. And although Nietzsche certainly has ontological implications, I don't know whether he's actually dealing with explicitly handling ontology. I mean, that's my doubt.
Indeed. I think it would be helpful if we could have a quotation where he talks about ontology, because...
Well, this is an example where he's using ontology.
No,
ontology is not the ontic. Ontology is not the ontic refers to things that can actually be. No, but ontic means things that can be thought about. Ontic. I'm just explaining this for everyone. There's more than just you, Diego. Ontic is like things that can be thought about. Anything you can think of is the ontic. Those are basically ideas and basically concepts. Anything that you can refer to that's in the mind. Those are ontic variables. But ontology means references. Ontology means things that can be referred to through language. That's the difference. When you can use language to clearly refer to something like religion, morality, teleology, truthfulness, self, despair, nihilism, viewpoint, being, the one, those are all ontological principles. And you can use all of those ontological, and you can create your own ontology, because ontology, after all, is the assignment of words to things. So the relation and the ontology, development of ontology, is basically the explication of how the words giving to things are related, and that's the meaning of ontology. So Nietzsche was using ontology all the time. It was just very hidden, and one of the techniques that he used was poetry. He would use his poetic gift to hide and not concentrate on the elucidation of the ontology or the dialectic explanations behind it. He would just simply expose the ontology and try to add some poetry and some force through his argumentation. He used argumentation to gain force, not to develop or to establish the perfection of the ontology that he was using.
James, you have a strange understanding of the word ontology and ontic. For example, ontology has to do with being. That's what onto means. Ontology is the logos of being.
Yeah.
Ontic, you use the word ontic. Are you using in the Heideggerian sense? Because in the Heideggerian sense, ontic is not what we think, but ontic is the material objects. And ontology instead it talks about being. So he's talking being of beings, where the beings are the entity, the object, whatever we see and we touch. And the ontology instead talks of the being, capital B, Sein in German, of beings.
But that was Heidegger's project. It's correct. But nevertheless, ontology covers all of being. It covers the being of rubber bands. It covers the being of alligators. It covers the being of morality. It covers the being of teleology. It covers the being of consciousness. In other words, whatever it is that you want, whatever being that you want to analyze, there is an ontology that can be developed for that being. Heidegger was special because he wanted to analyze the being of being, and that doesn't restrict the kind of being that is available to ontology, which is the investigation of being. I agree with you, it's the investigation of being, but being is not just humanity. In Christianity, it moved on here's some quotes. We are ready to admit all the hard things that Comte has said of the old ontologies. Here's another one. Even in the most nihilistic of ontologies, The eternal is meant to be functional, not be merely the blank and irrelevant negation of temporality. Today we need new ontologies constructed in the light of what science now tells us about man. So there's a concentration on man. But that's from 1950, Science Monthly. And now, today, ontology has a different meaning. We have the ontological web, which means that anything which can be an object is described as having an ontology. So if you're in the science of data, you're probably a bit of an ontologist. You're always describing the ontological relationships between different data elements, which is called an ontology. You describe an ontology appropriate to your domain, your application domain. Just like Heidegger described an ontology appropriate, that he felt was appropriate to the being of being. So this is all historical. This ontology has existed in its many forms as a kind of like a subset of metaphysics, but it comes from ancient times. It's been available to philosophers across the board. It didn't start with Sartre or Heidegger.
I'm curious, James, just because I don't know the philosophical landscape as well as some, but I'm looking, even with the wiki definition, it has, it's a study of being, but it also gives a definition that I posted in the chat that sounds similar to what you're referring to, looking at the relationships of concepts and categories. Is this the case, though, where certain meanings become prevalent and become the culture of that group, so that in philosophical worlds, when people hear the word ontology, they see it more as this study of being specifically? Is that why there's sort of a little bit of a clash here in terms of the definition?
I think I would call it a fetish. In other words, it is a tendency to fetishize a word, being, in this case, and make that being stand for existence, and make ontology, which is a study, of existence or being, as Aristotle put it, without a very good explanation, without really explaining really what he was talking about explicitly, but the idea that things existing constituted the possibility for an ontology, and then the later kind of like development of metaphysics. So the development of metaphysics and the idea that you would have a variety of interests that constituted metaphysics. But ontology was the specific interest in relationships between things, or relationships between beings.
Well, and to further muddy the waters, I can't remember which lecture it was of Matt's, but he essentially said Nietzsche was not was it Nietzsche? He said was not an existentialist, or no, that existentialism doesn't really even exist. I don't know whoever's been listening to the lectures, but he basically made a strong statement that it really, no one would call them, and these people that are classified as existentialists would not have called themselves existentialists, which threw me for a loop too. And I'm thinking, well, it's, I guess, arbitrary categories we give to help our own understanding. But
I don't think he used it as a personal pronoun. As a personal adjective. I think Nietzsche would have not called himself an existentialist. He would just called himself a philosopher, and a Zarathustra wannabe, perhaps, kind of the what do you call it? What do they call those now? I forget the Indian wise man who lives on the mountain.
A shaman.
Something like that. Yeah. Guru. That's what I was looking for. But so yeah, you can have people like that, and they might not necessarily be existentialists. That I think Nietzsche is kind of being lumped in with the existentialism to a certain extent because he's considered a seminal philosopher, and then people like Sartre and Heidegger would have Nietzsche on their minds. You know, they gave classes. Heidegger gave classes on Nietzsche. I don't think Sartre was a teacher, but and I didn't read Being and Nothingness. But the idea is that Nietzsche was somebody who was a seminal philosopher. He could have influenced people that were not even existentialists. We're not very existentialist. He could be influencing geopolitical thinkers. I think he had a very strong. To me, there's a very strong political message in Nietzsche. He's telling us. He's drawing us out. That some of us are going to be politicians. Some of us are going to embrace life in a very wide way.
I was wondering, would you compare him with Max Stirner then? Some people say Max Stirner preceded
I'm not familiar with Max Stirner.
Well, both are classified as dynamists. In other words, philosophers of power, almost an exact opposite to the rationalists. I think Rudolf Steiner claimed that he felt Nietzsche was somebody who started out as an idealist and a rationalist, and then he took a hammer to it all, so to speak, and had to go somewhere else, you know. He turns our values upside down. Our values are normally the rational, the ordered, but he decided, well, you know, I'm going to smash that up and forge on to dynamism.
Is that
dynamism is the idea that, you know, rather than the perfect structure, that we only exist because it's sort of like the Tao, you know, that there's forces in eternal sort of conflict, so to speak, or opposition.
So these the correct spelling. There's two different people: Rudolf Steiner and Max Stirner. Correct?
Max Stirner. When Nietzsche became famous, Max Stirner was a relative unknown, but people noted the similarity between Nietzsche's ideas and those of Stirner. You might say Stirner has preceded Nietzsche, and he's a bit like a watered-down version of Nietzsche, but he became classed as important in the 1890s when they realised there could be some link. So they're suddenly out searching for everything they could find about this lost philosopher. And of course, we do have his book, The Ego on Its Own, or, you know, the self
the ego
on
on
its property.
Own.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you would classify him as a psychologist, right? He was. I remember Stirner was like an amateur intellectual. That his book did fairly well. He killed himself before the book actually hit the bookstores. He hung himself on a stack of his books. His book. Very tragic story. It always seems like a tragic story when someone dies before their time. I was reading about this mathematician tonight. Came on my Quora email, which you know it's one of my the emails that I get. Anyway, so there he is. His name was Galois, Évariste Galois. He was killed in 1832 at the age of 20 in a duel over une femme. And on the night before the duel, he wrote a letter containing 60 pages of his math findings. And he's considered more important than some other mathematicians because he actually wrote a lot of math. He actually wrote a lot of math discoveries, and not just puzzles like some of the mathematicians are famous for. He actually wrote complete discoveries out. Galois. So that'll teach you, if you've got a broken heart, don't take it out on your fellow man. Just get on that bus. Look for another them.
I mean, death and suicide is a tragic event. But what did Nietzsche say about death? I mean, I can't remember. I mean, he must have said a lot about it, and I would think that he would be thinking about death in terms of equanimity, in the same mode that he would be thinking, I think, about the eternal, return. A person who can affirm the same thing, eternally, is in the right frame of mind, perhaps, to affirm death or one's loss. I mean, I don't know.
I think, well, in this book, at least, where he does a much better job of explaining it in the Gay Science, he says that the eternal, that he doesn't call it that, but the idea that if you think of this idea as occurring eternally, that you have, then it's probably a pretty good idea. So in other words, if you can sign on to your actions being eternal, or yourself being involved in that action eternally, then you're probably more likely to be right about it. And he was kind of contrasting this in this book. He's contrasting that with Kant's idea of categorical imperative. Kant's idea was that if you do something and you can imagine other people all doing it, then it's a good idea. And he said that was not very good because you're using your own personal rationality. Nietzsche said that's not good because you're using your own personal rationality to justify something on the basis that everyone else's personal rationality and everyone's sense of doing the right thing, doing right instead of wrong, is going to be the same as your own. And he says you can't count on that. You can't. Nietzsche is saying you can't count on that. Other people's ideas of right and wrong will be all a bit different, even if you don't suspect they are, even if you don't have that belief. So that could be a delusion. Instead, just imagine yourself doing it over and over for eternity and being just as satisfied as you are now. So it's a matter, for Nietzsche, it's a matter of satisfaction. We gain happiness from our moral decisions.
And if you haven't got it right, perhaps, it doesn't Nietzsche imply that the eternal return is a greater horror than death if you haven't got it right? If you have got it right, if you have got life right, it seems, then you can bear the eternal, return with joy and happiness.
Yeah. I think that's what he's saying. I'm going to get the number in case anyone wants to go over that. I thought it was pretty good. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I've got it in my notes, so I'll look there first. Number 341. Number 341.
Derek, I'm going to go back to something you mentioned a while back. You talked about sort of the American landscape. And And so I'm Canadian, but it would be similar in the West here. You're talking about sort of this attachment to good and evil, particularly to people. And I think it speaks to what Nietzsche has referenced a number of times, this idea of wanting to have this clarity for comfort's sake, this black and whiteness, and so that there'll be just literally a great divide of this is all good and this is all bad. Um, Also, I feel that there's a focus on product over process. So, that tangible outcome. And I feel those are biases within our culture, or tendencies within our culture. We oversimplify life. And so we will almost in a elementary kind of way classify things distinctly as good or bad, not allowing for there to be this gray, or even that, like even with leadership, somebody who will absolutely make strong statements is seen as a strong leader, as opposed to somebody who would say, we don't know what the outcome will be. Let's trust our morals and our values and our intelligence and go forth into the unknown. People are just not really respecting that as a leader, which is actually a super strong leader. That's somebody who's very confident in leading people in their own leadership. So yes, I would say that you are correct in saying that there's some strong tendencies in the West that would be contrary to what Nietzsche has outlined.
I mean, I'm particularly concerned with the ideas of good and evil, or beyond good and evil, as Nietzsche framed it, as a construct, as a very powerful construct in the form of ethics. That Nietzsche, it seems to me, was trying to deconstruct the whole idea of ethics, how it is. The Christian idea of ethics is one example of self-sacrifice, etc. We need a different way, I think, of conceiving, of ourselves, apart from the ethical one. I mean, psychology is one way, just one example. Ethically, a neutral view. Why did you do this? It's not a question of it was good or it was bad. It was a pathological act or a healthy act. Yeah.
I think that Nietzsche wanted us to establish justice for the first time. So the idea that we know what is good already is he says is very suspicious, and we need to begin. There has to be a period where we start trusting ourselves, and this is the existentialist part. In other words, it's our own being in the world that gives us a basis to trust ourselves. It gives us those outcomes that he talks about, that we can feel satisfied with. So it's in finding those outcomes that give us satisfaction, we begin to lose our tetheredness on the old morality. And by loosening our tetheredness on the old morality, we begin to open up the possibility of real justice. Not the kind of justice that's based on blame-making and punishment, renewed suffering. Not that kind of justice, but a new justice that's more based in personal responsibility, personal creativity as well. So in other words, he does want to achieve the Apollonian Dionysian balance that he thinks that was probably achieved in Athens society, but he wants to but he wants to achieve it in the current world. He doesn't want to sort of like bring that whole society forward, but he thinks there's a possibility of loosening the tetheredness that we have to the fixed morality, which has become, a force unto itself. So that is, I think, where his direction is all through this book, to try to loosen the tethers of morality, so that a new possibility of existence, which includes new concepts of justice, new concepts of creativity, and new concepts of life, will spring forth.
Who was it that attacked the concept of the moral automaton? It was maybe it was C.S. Lewis. I'm not too sure. It's the idea that would we be truly moral beings if we were just following the script? And this is very much what society wants to make us do: follow the moral script. But if we're simply purely doing this, is that truly moral?
You make a distinction between morality and ethics. Because I would say it's moral. It's not necessarily ethical.
Well, yeah, we're probably talking about more the Christian, perhaps possibly the Christian ideal of morality, that it's certainly something super earthly. Certainly by the old standard, moral was the mores of a particular society. This is how it is, and that's that. But of course, the philosopher's morality is something higher, something more spiritual, and
yeah, that's my understanding. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, the critique of ethics as following a script has been made by a lot of people, from Immanuel Kant to Bernard Williams. That simply doing what one is supposed to do is not moral. And there you have the existentialist idea of choice, crucial feature. Well, if you don't choose whatever it is, even if you don't know what exactly you're choosing, you have to choose, regardless. And that's the existential ethic, perhaps the existential ethic, or at least a Sartrean ethic of choice, authenticity, and freedom, perhaps.
I was just going to mention at this point, for the sake of James, that Max Stirner earned the ire of Marx, and Marx wrote a polemic against him in the what was the work called, the German Ideology, I think. So I think it's getting to be a well-known work now. There were a few others that particularly met Marx's eye, but Stirner was actually, he wrote his book, The Unique and Its Property, or The Ego on Its Own, as an assault upon the ideals of Feuerbach. Yeah, I put the link for the German Ideology on Stirner up in the chat.
Yeah, Feuerbach is definitely one of my favorites. He was a neo-Hegelian that heavily criticized Christianity. He gave Marx, apparently he gave Marx the idea for dialectical materialism, without Marx being able to take the credit. He didn't call it that, but Feuerbach, it was kind of Feuerbach's idea and then in a book called The Essence of Christianity, he basically took Protestantism and Catholicism and subjected them to different critiques, basically a series of critiques of the standard forms of German religion by Feuerbach.
Yeah, well, Stern had participated in the Young Hegelians. The only thing we know of him are the sort of comical illustrations that Engels made years later when people wanted to find out who this guy was. We don't know if he actually met Marx, but he did know Engels and Feuerbach, it seems.
Oh, cool.
He's merely the teacher in a girls' class. I think that was about all.
A what?
He was a tutor in a girls'
tutoring
class,
in a girls' school. Yeah, good. Yeah, well, good for him. Except for how he decided to end himself after his publication.
Got a truly great book that I'd like to give to everyone here. Well, I mean, just recommend. From Hegel to Nietzsche by Karl Loeth, and I'm not all the way through, but I'm about 100 pages in. This book talks about all of this. It goes through, obviously, Hegel and Nietzsche, but also, all the rest of them that you're talking about, Feuerbach and Stirner. It's a very exhaustive book and actually pretty easy to read. I recommend this highly. There's a lot of good insight in this volume. So I give this my highest recommendation to everybody.
Great.
Yeah. This one is.
He does make mention of Stirner in that one, does he?
Yes, yeah. He goes over everybody that's going on in the 19th century thought. And, there's a lot in there about Feuerbach and Stirner.
Yeah, that answers that question that I was asking. There's a lot of implied Hegel in Nietzsche, but you can't smell it. In other words, Nietzsche is a very careful writer. Like I was saying before, he does things without your being able to detect it. He does philosophical tricks like ontological analysis without your being able to actually detect it, because he's hiding it. And the Hegel has got to be there. I mean, Nietzsche is German after all. In the 19th century, the same century as Hegel, so he can't be completely oblivious to the existence of these other people. Yeah. Who he doesn't talk about.
In the more comically exhibits about Stirner, what they're saying his basic premise was, with, I think, Feuerbach and all that, was we got rid of God. That was one spook. And then he was asking them, why are you trying to bring in new spooks and enslave us with the spooks again? We just got rid of one spook and now you're trying to bring in new spooks.
The reason is he was brought up in a German family. He was the son of a minister. In a sense, he wasn't quite a half orphan. He was somebody on I watched something on YouTube where the guy said that his father died when Nietzsche was 5 years old. So he had kind of like a background in Christianity. He probably had to have some kind of a Christian family, since his mother was married to a minister. So the family had to be somewhat Christian. But it was all female. Everyone in the household was female, and that was a very special nature to his upbringing. It was probably homeschooled times 2, 3, 4, or 5, or something like that. It was like always having some kind of a mentoring female figure around at all times. Very kindly aunts, kindly mother, and so forth.
Yeah, the other big issue that was in the material was Nietzsche's view of the universe, and he's claiming that the scientific view of the universe, yeah, it's a little bit correct, but it's just a tiny band on what's probably the entire spectrum of the cosmos. And of course, that's, in the 19th century, their whole mindset seemed to be, well, we don't know every detail, but we know the universe is between A and Z. That seemed to be the mindset. Whereas Nietzsche's saying, oh no, I don't want to be constricted by that. He's firstly perhaps claiming that there's a passivity in that sort of empiricism, that you've adopted this attitude. It's a sort of Munchausen attitude that, so to speak, they're picking themselves up out of the ocean by their own pigtails. They're being guided by their own light. If you go looking at the universe in a certain way, you'll find what you think should be there.
Mm-hmm. Good night, Michelle.
I have a really good series, another one of my favorite teachers, but I don't have it incomplete, but it also covers Nietzsche. Maybe we'll go over that one when we're finished with this round. But I don't have it complete, though, but it does cover a lot of history, mostly biography. There's no readings. It's just, he's talking a lot about Nietzsche's background and history that we seem to be talking about right now. He growing up as this preacher's son, and a lot of history that we're talking about, and it's not very long. I think it's like 4 episodes, classes, and maybe we'll do that when we get done with this round. It's something to listen to, but it does cover a lot of. I got a lot out of it. Some of the basic psychology of Nietzsche from his upbringing, and it's very interesting to listen to. Maybe I'll give that as a supplement.
Yeah, you could just put it in there as a link.
Yeah. Maybe I'll do that. Yeah, but there's a lot of good.
This one was from
Hegel I didn't
to
know
Nietzsche. Hegel to Nietzsche, was it, or?
Oh, the book that I recommended. Yeah, Karl Loeth. I don't know how you say the umlaut there.
Yeah, it sounds like Lith. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Okay,
Lövith. It could, if he's German, it would be, Karl Lövith.
Oh, wow. Diego, how about that? Diego has it. Good for you, man. Yeah, there it is. From Hegel to Nietzsche. Yeah. Karl Loeth is a really significant figure, and he's just kind of forgotten now. But I have a number of his books based on the strength of this one, which I hope to get to. I admit I haven't started, but I want to get through this one first. Yeah, Diego's got a copy.
Actually, there's a whole chapter about the young Hegelian that we were discussing 20 minutes ago. There's a whole chapter which is well written.
Yeah, that's right. If you're interested in these topics that we were talking about for a big chunk of tonight, that's the book. That's the book you want to go through to get the information.
And they cover Feuerbach, Roth, Marx, Stern, Bauer, and also Kierkegaard. So that's good. And Schelling, of course.
Yeah, if we're interested in covering this stuff, it's an essential text.
Thank you for reminding us.
I was just thinking about that famous poster from, I think it's US poster from World War I, which has the Teutons as an advancing great ape threatening civilization. So I'd say stop these mad German philosophers would be more the poster, I think. First they'll come with thoughts, and then they'll come with bullets.
It reminds me of Marx and Engels, right? The Marx, the Russians, what were they called? The Soviet Union. Before it was the Soviet Union, they had these posters of Marx and Engels and Lenin. Marx, Engels, Lenin. Then later it was Marx, Engels, Lenin. Stalin, and the rest, and then the rest are all killed. Yeah, and eventually there was one, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Mao, So, and now you have, I've read a bit of Xi Jinping, and one of his big claims to fame is he is an expert on Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong thought. So in the works of Xi Jinping, you can read the best of Maoism, because he's got some of the best of Mao Zedong's ideas, strewn through his lectures. Not probably in the early. I'm reading the first book, so it's like in the early Xi Jinping. He was very concerned with the what was useful in Mao Zedong thought.
Okay, so what do you think the deal with Xi Jinping is? What's the big?
He's a great intellectual. He is a great intellectual. He's as boring as most of those other Stalinists. I think his last big, the big speech at the 1919 was to 3.5 hours. Which was about par for the course within the Soviet Union. So it's like that part hasn't changed. But if you actually read the speech, you might like it. It talks a lot about environment and democracy and following the people and all that stuff. The good part of Maoism, the idea that you always follow the people. It was a correction of Marxism in a sense. The idea that you follow the people, you don't try to decide what's right and then stick to the plan. You always go back and reassess.
Well, a lot of the chaos in America, my big belief, you might say, is quite deliberately coming from places like China. We're at war, but China can't attack the United States militarily.
China attack is not likely to attack anyone. The idea with China, according to the Chinese intellectuals, is that China stays on plan. China is Confucius. China is poetry. China is people living in peace. China. The idea is that whatever China is going to do, they're going to stay on plan. They're not going to suddenly start attacking other countries willy-nilly. So
you believe this?
Well, that's what they say. I don't want to get into a geopolitics argument. I'm just saying that what the intellectuals are all saying, that if they're from China, is they say China stays on plan. And then the horror story, right, which some of the people in the West would want to say, is that China had this thing called the Cultural Revolution, which wasn't a revolution at all. It was a imposition on the thinking of the people from the top. Yeah. Well, it was kind of, it was that type of thing, and then China could try to impose that type of thing on the entire world, but the situation in China is not exactly like that because of capitalism. So China has a form of capitalism which they call socialism with Chinese characteristics. So, and they're even in denial about that. They don't believe that it's capitalism. They just believe that it's socialism with corporations. So, whatever you think it is, whether you're kind of like deluding yourself one way or deluding yourself the other, China has a history. So we should look at Chinese history. I think that the bit about the Chinese history is that China doesn't attack anyone. China is just.
I know that you were
there was a war with Vietnam, and there was a war with Vietnam. Yeah, at some point, right in the maybe in the 18th or 17th century or something like that. I don't know when it was, but
now we have a China which is very dependent on trade.
Well, they're not the only ones that are dependent, Stephen. the trade balance between Australia and China is way in China's favor. It's not in Australia's favor. So
no,
I mean,
actually,
it is in Australia's favor. It's way in Australia's favor. Yeah. So like the dependence is kind of like we do our business with these other countries, and that brings more wealth, and we like that. That's the kind of dependence it is. But it's not kind of like if Australia cut ties with China, it would be the Australian production that would be hurt much more than it would be the Chinese production that would hurt. So it's about it's around the nature of 2/3 to 1/3 or something, or worse. Yeah, it's pretty severe in that case. So of course you've got the situation in the United States now, which is just as bad. So I don't know what the trade balance is there, but it's similar. It's more weighted in favor of the benefit of the United States. So yeah, so I'm not saying that China is a good guy. It's just that China is a kind of country that has links with other countries. And they're not links necessarily of domination. They're links of financial and trade relationships. Free trade, in other words.
Yeah, I'd say China's moving towards domination. That's the grand plan.
But how would they convert to domination from being a trade partner?
Well, they're not going to attack your strengths. They're going to look for your weaknesses. And America has internal weaknesses. Strong on the outside, but soft in the center.
I'll go along with that. No, America. I mean, the United States has problems. There's tremendous problems with morale. There's problems with government. There's this idea, that because there is a government and the government has a strong history, and it's very complex, and it's very democratic, and sort of democratic. People will deny the democratic.
There used to be the Puritan work ethic.
Right. They used, yeah, you're right. Yeah. So, and they have some of that still. I mean, similar to German culture in that way. It's been compared to Germany. The United States is more like Germany than it is like England. But it's going to be if it's going to be a problem of power in terms of like one country becomes more powerful, can you really call that domination? If, in other words, one country drives itself into weakness and another country drives itself through socialism with Chinese characteristics or something like that.
My point is that China is helping you in your weakness, facilitating your weakness.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now in
but it's
reference
not going
to
be
the
like
Greeks,
it's not going to be like the Opium Wars, though. It's not going to. I mean, it's not going to be like the opium that was delivered by Great Britain to China, to Hong Kong. It's not going to be that kind of helping you in your weakness. It's going to be more like, you need some plastic, we'll give you plastic. You need, there was the idea, if you want cell phones, we'll give you cell phones. You want electronics, we'll give you electronics. It's like whatever, that kind of weakness. And the sort of Trump way that they're trying to counter that is that, well, we're not going to take the cell phones anymore. So you just keep your cell phones, keep your electronics. You won't allow Google. We're going to take away your TikTok. It's whatever. So there is this kind of like trying to fight a high-level trade war, but it's not necessarily going to work. In other words, a country with 1.4 million people may yet become more powerful than a country with 300 million people, but
I mean,
that doesn't
the numbers
necessarily.
aren't
But that doesn't
particular.
necessarily mean domination. That can just simply mean peace and trade. It doesn't have to mean any kind of domination, in my opinion.
The thing with America is it doesn't need the world.
No.
China does to survive. America can survive without the world.
What about North Korea? They've been surviving. There was a prediction that North Korea couldn't possibly survive without the world, yet they were capable of doing that. So with some starvation, I admit there were problems in North Korea. So what if China, just went the way of North Korea? In other words, what if the world decided to take away the world from China? It couldn't happen, but I'm just saying, let's say you were right. So if you were right, then what would happen to China? Well, China would be more like North Korea than it is now. And would that be a bad thing?
Which one of China's enemies have you left out?
And China's enemies, what?
China has two big opponents, very big opponents. Japan's the other one. Japan's the one that's leading the coalition against them, in a sense, with Japanese money. But anyway, what my point actually is, where we're living in strange times, and the whole thing with the Greeks, that their whole tragic tradition arose when they were living in strange times. They'd been these happy little Greeks doing their theatre, dancing around at night, having their vino. Great time, man. Then suddenly, bang, 100-foot giant shows up on their doorstep called the Persian Empire, ready to crush them at any moment. And we see this whole flowering of Greek thought appear in the stress of that, the birth of tragedy, Oh, well, let's watch a tragedy because we're all dead tomorrow. The Persians obviously cannot be beaten. I mean, the whole sense of the Spartans going off to fight to certain death is inspired by the tragedy that, tragedy is the eventual result. That's in the Bhagavad Gita, I suppose, the idea of the noble death, that it's better to, fight with honour and die with honour than live with shame. I don't know, the heroic sort of image there. This is just constantly overlooked, this aspect of the huge Persian Empire sitting on their doorstep.
Yeah, that's true today. I mean, if you can draw, if you look at maps a lot, you can actually draw various plans of attack of Israel from Persia. So it's not they don't have just one path to get to Israel. They don't have to go through Lebanon. They can go through Lebanon or they can go through Iraq. It doesn't really matter how they get there. So there's kind of like that same concept of geopolitical domination still exists. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's always going to be a war. War is like always the last resort when diplomacy, or what we philosophers prefer to call it, dialogue, fails. If people actually talk about things, then there should never be any of these situations where they need to say, we will destroy you or we will destroy you just because we don't like you, and so on and so forth.
I'm the sort that looks back in history and say they always talk nice at the start, always in a very gentlemanly fashion and all that, to the point where they're destroying entire cities by the end of the conflict, and say, well, the other side deserves it.
I think that's exaggerating it a little, but yeah, I think definitely in the case of Europe in the 20th century, that's what you had. You had in Europe, there was that tendency.
It went from the German bomber dropping a few bombs on London by accident, and I think it was Daring rings up Goring and says, "Oh, look what you've done! Goring, I'll punish these pilots. They've done the wrong thing." That was at the start of the war, and look how it ends up.
Right. Yeah, it's the endings that we're afraid of, you know, and the endings are something to be avoided. But of course, each of these countries are big boys, and that's the basic argument. That's my last argument on China, and maybe we should change the subject back.
Yes.
But my final argument is that China, just like the United States, is a big boy. So big boys don't cry. Big boys try to do the right thing. Big boys, you know, even if there's a threat, they pick themselves up. So don't underestimate China. Whatever you do, it's one of the big boys.
We could almost underestimate the West at the moment. They seem to be behaving like a pack of screaming Sheilas, as we say in Australia.
Yeah, that's right. Don't listen to the Sheilas. Just simply, you know, participate. And the way you participate is dialogue.
Well, we had a long period of comfort, you know, post-war, you know, that the West looked like it, you know, was dominating the world completely and didn't have too many serious challenges other than the Soviet Union.
Oh, the Soviet Union was a pushover, wasn't it? It was that leader. It was I forget his name now.
Gorbachev.
Gorbachev. It was Gorbachev that made it all possible. You know, so as Gorbachev met with Reagan, and they found that their philosophies were compatible. So they arranged for the de-escalation of the Cold War, which was
the
fantastic.
Ronald Reagan that used to sing bombs on Russia. That Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, Reagan was kind of like a big thinker. I don't fault Reagan for being the asshole that he was, but you know, he was a big thinker. And his ability to see eye to eye with Gorbachev was precious. It was a great historical moment. It'll always live as an important moment. It was bad for Russia, but that had a lot to do with the Soviet Union and Russian weakness, and you know, there were possible other problems in the Soviet Union that I don't even know about, but there was a certain amount of Russian weakness, and you know, the history did not turn out as well for Russia as it turned out for the United States in that encounter. But for a while, Russia was great guns. Russia was doing very well for 20, 30 years, I'd say.
It seemed to be when the world was moving beyond the closed economies, you know, the Milton Friedman type policies. Now, I don't fully agree with his ideas, his policies, but they did turn out to be quite powerful. And, you know, you had Soviet Union was just trying to do things the old way, and, you know, the global economy was just, you know, bypassing it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Okay. So anyone else want to get in on Nietzsche, or we hit the 2.5 hour mark again, David?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the other issue was Nietzsche talking about how Christianity created the weapon which destroyed it. Of course, that's his the death of God premise, is it created a devotion to truth in philosophical speculation, which suddenly saw the weaknesses of Christianity. So what would you say there, Mr. Cook?
Yeah, he's right. He's right. Yeah, Christianity bore the seeds of its own destruction, in the same sense as the Soviet Union bore the seeds of its own destruction.
Well, then there was Nietzsche's four. What was it? His four things he saw in Christianity. I think, you know, one of the basic premises when, well, Christianity said that even the meanest person had a value that was super earthly, that was beyond the state, that was beyond all power, except maybe the Pope. That even if you were a beggar in the gutter, that the Christian world was going to have to give you just that little bit of dignity that you could be a soul on your way to God's. And that was in his death of God. That was one of the things that was being taken away. You could be reduced to having no value. And this became a crisis for the imagination.
Yeah, there's this one of the sections, is it 119? It's section 119. Basically, Nietzsche said that altruism is the tendency to try to turn oneself into a function. And then he says one of the most misogynistic things that he says, you know, which he does have a few great misogynistic sayings. I shouldn't say it that way. I should say interesting misogynistic sayings. But he says that women are especially, some women, he says some women, without, you know, necessarily being a bigot, he says some women are especially good at this. They attach themselves to a man in some function of a man's, such as defending the man intellectually, taking on part of his social life, taking on secretarial function, and so on and so forth. So the altruism reflects itself in the willingness of an individual to turn himself into a function. Because we want to do something for someone else. We don't want to do it for ourselves. And then this is what contradicts, interestingly, this is what contradicts Heidegger, and could have been one of Heidegger's starting points, that the idea that it is the being for the sake of itself that becomes the highest, achieves the highest level of self-awareness.
Okay, so you're saying, yeah, I think there was a conflict with Heidegger. Yeah, I sort of vaguely remember that. That was the conflict, was it?
Well, no, I see that as possibly one of the starting points for Heidegger. Heidegger read Nietzsche.
Oh, sorry, I was meaning Hegel. I think that was sort of I think the existential philosophers, in a sense, were the strong reaction against the Hegelian worldview.
I don't know. I don't really, I haven't fully analyzed it myself. I'm kind of a Hegelian myself, and Heidegger talks of Hegel admiringly. He doesn't criticize Hegel the way he criticizes Kant and the Cartesian philosophers. So Hegel is Hegel's a special case. If you've read Hegel's preface, if you've read the preface to the Phenomenology, you kind of realize Hegel was a really, really, really deep thinker about thinking. So that was Hegel's strong point, and that's not a bad thing for Hegel to have gone deep on thought. So So I look at him from that kind of like admiring standpoint. I think Hegel's influence on all of this was a very positive one. No matter where you stand on Hegel's methodology, you know, if you think Hegel was a fool for this, believing this, or Hegel was, you know, foolish for believing the methodology would solve all the problems of philosophy and so on. No, you're right. He didn't solve all the problems. He was extremely bigoted on aristocracy. He was just on this, anyone with power was already right. You didn't have to have any further discussion about it because the power was the right. So
the picture I've gotten is Hegel's worldview became like a striding giant that was going to squash the individual, and that existentialism was the revolts of the individual against this, the revolts of the subjective.
That's putting it into a romantic frame.
Oh,
Hey,
sorry,
that
I'll
might.
go and execute myself for romanticism right now.
Yeah. We should have colors. We send each other color. That's a romantic color. Sending you a
Lead me down the street parade
dogmatic
with
color.
the big fool's cap on me, and the sign hung around me, a hopeless romantic.
Yeah. So it's a blue for changing the subject, or whatever. Yeah. Great. That was a great meeting again, David. Love it.
Yeah. Certainly. I've listened to the next few, and they're up already for November 2nd. Wow, election week. Hope we're not too filled with anxiety, and we'll be able to concentrate on the important stuff of Nietzsche.
If we're filled with anxiety, it's appropriate. Yeah.
I can see Donald Trump striding along the horizon, going fee, fi, fo, fum.
Yeah. But I have heard the next two, and they're really good. They're really good. Well, there's a lot of good stuff, and I bet we'll have a lot to say about them. November 2nd. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, everyone that's in America, vote. Yeah, I already voted.
Okay, everyone. See you guys.
Okay, yeah. Great meeting. Yeah, lots of fun.
All right.
Thank you.
I'll go and whip myself for my sins right now.
Right.
Good night, guys. It was really nice discussing with you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Good night, Diego.